Hey there, thanks for tuning into the podcast We're Just Talking About It. Your host for the show is Major Retired Jason Chris Hauk. He's the author of an award-winning modern English Quran interpretation, and he speaks nationally about Islam. He holds a master's in Middle East Studies, he studied Dari and Arabic, and teaches Introduction to Islam courses at numerous institutions.
Hi, I'm Jason Hauk. This is We're Just Talking About It. We're going to explore the myths and stereotypes in America that we've all heard since September 11th. Since that horrible tragedy, we have done a bad job in our country of explaining what Islam is, what Islam isn't, and helping to bridge the divide between Muslims and non-Muslims. Let's change that.
Hey guys, I'm Holly, the producer for We're Just Talking About It. And have you ever just wondered what the difference is between Sunni or Shia, or how to use Sharia law in a sentence? We're getting down to the bottom, to the basics of Islam 101 for the average American who just wants to learn how to talk about it. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 10 of We're Just Talking About It. This week, we wrap up our series of interviews with Shireen Qudosi. If you haven't listened, we recommend going back to episode number 8 and learning about who Shireen is and what she's doing here in the U.S. And today we talk about reform and a campaign she is leading in our country to stop hate. We also take a look at what reform looks and sounds like to Shireen, plus who are hate imams, and how are these priest-like figures using the religion of Islam to manipulate some of the community.
That brings us to what we'll probably kind of touch on for the rest of the talk today. This idea of reform. There's this Muslim reform movement. There's an idea to reform some Muslim cultures or reform the way some people interpret Islam. That is one of those topics that comes up. But why don't you just tell us what you see Muslim reform to mean and how you got involved in it, and we'll just kind of go from there.
Yeah, so reform is a very tricky thing because there's so many people using it. You have Muslim reformers who have their own definition. You have Islamists now using the word reform. And then you've got this sort of, the right-wing agenda of reform, which is basically destroy Islam. Reform in its broader sense, because reform is much bigger than any one of these sort of three groups that I mentioned right now. Reform is going back to the source. What is Islam, period? Or giant question mark, more appropriately. And going back to that, so I summarize Muslim reform as where philosophy and scholarship blend with love for an intelligence, and intelligence with a capital I. Philosophy and scholarship blend with love for an intelligence greater than holy men and holy books. What does that mean? That means that Islam from day one has been very, very deeply woven with philosophy, with scholarship that came after the years of the Prophet's death. And so we have this very rich legacy of exploration. And in the last 100 years, that's really died off. And we need to sort of resurrect that, ask these beautiful questions, and remember that this is not about obsession over a book or a text or a leader. This is about God. The reason that we are people of faith is because of God. Everything else is secondary and supplementary. And so when we reinvoke that connection, and this is one of the things I really love about Islam, is that you don't need middlemen. You don't need it at all. You can go to the source itself. And so when we use scholarship, when we use philosophy, we use beauty and art to go back and to understand God, understand the message, understand what is this intelligence telling us? How is it a guide for our lives? And how has this sort of message been derailed? And how do we get back to the source? I think that's really the solution here.
So really questioning, how did we get away from this idea of Muslim scholars and Muslims being thinkers and explorers and scholars and philosophers? How do we get back to that where now everybody wants to be in lockstep, and you don't want to get out of line because you may anger some man, when Islam was always about the one true God, and you can talk to God and you can follow God's words. They're written down in one book. And so I think that's an interesting way to phrase it. And when I teach courses, I always get I throw out a question. Hey, what was going on in we'll say the Middle East or the Muslim world during the Dark Ages in Europe? And most people are like, I don't know. I said, well, they were collecting they were holding all the information that all the world had known at that point. And after the Dark Ages, Europe borrowed it back. that information would have been lost without all those Muslim scholars and philosophers and mathematicians and engineers who were holding the knowledge of the world.
And beautifully, at that time, we were all so, not we, because it wasn't even an idea at that point, but they were engaging with, Greek philosophy and Jewish mysticism. And there was this collaboration, which we don't see today. Now we see, oh, you can't have an opinion because you're not a Muslim. And it's such an ignorant view. When we look at Islamic philosophy, Islamic scholarship, we also look at the problem is in the solution, or vice versa. So when you had all these beautiful, the scholarly debates, and when you study them, they're actually really heretical. I mean, there are things that people have said back then that, and whatever I have said that's provocative pales in comparison to some of these really rich debates. But what happened is that because Islam was so diverse, it was practiced so diversely, you had so many schools of thought arise, you had so many different systems of Islamic sciences. And so what happened is that as this faith is blossoming, at the same time it's becoming codified. So a lot of the scholarship, the legal rulings, it became part of the faith, so that you go from a simple faith, which was truly very, very simple, to this system, which is more like the Matrix. And so reform is about, going back and deconstructing, removing some of the systemic, the fossilization that's happened within the faith, and going back to this sort of simpler, more evolving, mutable religion.
I think one of the things I notice as I talk to groups around America is everybody believes there is this one Muslim culture it's a monolithic religion and everybody feels the same way. And I always try to compare it to Christianity. And I say, if you were looked around in our little county here in North Carolina, there's probably 100 Protestant churches. And they all have a different opinion about how you should worship. They got the same Bible, and they're all reading out of the same hymnal probably in the back of the pew. But the way they see the world and how they would worship is a little bit different. And I think people miss that when they look at Islam, that over the years there's been this huge mosaic of thought and groups. And so it is hard when you talk about going back to just a common way of looking at Islam in a more simplified way. How do you get back there without losing the good things, but getting rid of some of the baggage that's been put on over the years that really has nothing to do with the Quran?
Yeah, no, your analogy is brilliant, and and I'll add to it that if you take that analogy and apply it towards Muslims, you get 10 Muslims in a room, and you can ask them all the same questions, have them write down the answer on a piece of paper, and you just ask, what is Islam? You're going to get maybe 8 to 10 different answers, because we've sort of settled on this idea that Islam means peace, and it actually doesn't. It means submission, but even then, what does submission mean? It's not necessarily a negative. We submit to a lot of things in life that I can go on and on about. That's not necessarily a submission by force. It's a submission by acceptance. But aside from that, when we look at Islam as peace, we forget the sort of duality that is Islam that makes Islam really beautiful. It's that Islam is not just peace. It's peace and war. And let's go deeper than that. Islam is choice, is what I would say. If I had to say, what is Islam? I would say Islam is choice. And so if you ask 10 Muslims, what does Islam mean? You're going to get, or what makes a Muslim? You're going to get 10 different answers. People will say, the generic Islam is peace, or they'll say it means you have to believe in the 5 pillars, or it means you have to believe in Muhammad, or it means you have to believe in the articles of faith. And technically none of those answers are really correct, because if the articles of faith didn't come till later, the pillars didn't come till later. Yeah. It was really just, do you believe in God? Period. Done. And that's really all there is to it. And so if we can go back to even the core question, and this is why asking these questions is so important, because we can't have a conversation until we have these questions with sort of real interest and authenticity of dialogue.
How difficult is it, and we won't go to the world now, but just in America, how difficult is it to have a conversation about Islam, even among Muslims? I mean, you mentioned you put 10 in the room, you're going to get 8 different answers. I mean, what makes it difficult in America to have this conversation among different Muslim groups about how you should worship and how you should should or shouldn't integrate, and how you should raise your children, and how do you avoid radicalization, or is radicalization even a problem? I mean, there's so many varying opinions. But what makes it challenging in your eyes?
So in my opinion, what makes it really difficult to have this conversation about, what is Islam, what is Muslim, is what I will call the noise and the distraction of the propaganda, the media, the failed policies, when the most orthodox representation of Islam in Sunni Islam, who are sort of the faux progressives or the Islamists, when they're highlighted, supported with enormous wealth, and given sort of unfiltered media access and unfiltered government support through prior administrations, it becomes really, really hard to have honest conversations, because first and foremost, the people who are silenced are individuals like myself, individuals who sort of fall on the spectrum outside of orthodoxy. And so that becomes really, really difficult, because we're challenging now something that's set up as a monolith. When you look at the monolith of what is the representation of Islam, when in all honesty there is no one representation of Islam. And so when those supported individuals who are the most orthodox, I can't even say conservative, but they're the most orthodox interpretations of Islam, when those are supported ironically by the most liberal factions in society, it makes it very difficult to have an honest conversation. When we look at the sort of phenomenon of Trump, which people don't understand, why would you support President Trump? And it comes down to not supporting him. It comes down to supporting the environment that gets created. And obviously, I'm not a psychic. I don't know the details of how that would have fanned out, but it is playing out in the sense that it has forced a conversation that is much wider than it has ever existed in American history prior to this point in history.
So even as uncomfortable as the 2016 campaign was, and all the rhetoric that was thrown out and the incorrect vocabulary and utter confusion, it has helped open a conversation in America. And I felt it, because I started talking about Islam in 2015 before there was even talk about the election. And as I was still wandering around the country while this election was going on and afterwards, I noticed more people came to my talks about Islam. More people had pointed questions. More Muslims came to my talks. More Muslims started inviting me to come speak at their groups, because the conversation really opened up. For better or for worse, it opened up.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I call Trump basically a chaos agent in the best sense, in that, the things that are said, for better or worse, force conversations. They also force experiential change. So after his presidency, for example, backtrack, before he won the election, I knew that, okay, once you have sort of dethroned the Sunni supremacist orthodoxy from the main stage, it's going to force a little bit of a leveling of the playing field. That happened. That is happening. And it's forcing us to sort of interact with each other more, which is fantastic. What I didn't see happening is how the sort of first draft of the election would change someone like myself. So while I knew the landscape would change, other people would change, I didn't foresee that I would change. I mean, obviously, again, I'm not psychic. So I didn't understand that I would start seeing mask slipping among people who now felt they didn't need to play nice anymore. Things people felt comfortable saying that they've never said before. I experienced tokenism very deeply, at the same time that I'm seeing increased rhetoric from individuals who no longer feel the need to have that facade. And then I start seeing what subtle bigotry looks like. So we had, 2017, we had, of course, neo-Nazi rallies, Charlottesville. We have all of this going on in the most extreme sense, and it's shocking when you look at the photos. I mean, it's really shocking. But at the same time, I'm seeing this sort of hidden, ravine of hatred and bigotry and arrogance. Really, it's arrogance within certain circles who feel that Muslim voices don't matter. Islam can't be reformed. Islam is the problem. So it's a much more beautifully camouflaged demonstration of hate that is really not that different from neo-Nazi rallies. And that changed me a lot, in the sense that I now understood, even though I don't agree with the politics of Islamism and Islamist organizations, some of their arguments now started making sense. And so that's important, because I can't have that conversation with another group or another individual unless I on some level can understand them. And when it comes to being able to move forward, that means having that conversation with everyone. It doesn't matter how much you may despise them or how much you may disagree with them. It's so important for us to sort of push past this and be able to sit at a table and be able to dialogue in some sort of meaningful way.
And I've noticed that when I teach my classes, I see the same students over and over for a few weeks, and I can always start dividing the class up into what you just described. There are people who don't understand Islam. There are people who hate every Muslim they've never met. There are people who pretend that they would really like Muslims if they would just change, and in the end I find out that means they want you to give up your religion and change to be a Christian. And you just get all these different voices on the non-Muslim side. So this has opened a conversation. I don't think it's going to be a comfortable conversation, but I think it's good to get everybody to put their cards on the table a little bit cleaner, because it seems like people have been hiding what they really feel. And this is a chance to talk about it more. And I think we'll all learn a little bit more, and hopefully the education side of it will take hold, and you'll get a few more people to be honest and maybe open their mind and change their views a little bit.
I don't expect any of these conversations to be comfortable. I don't think it's going to be. You learn a few things along the way in terms of how to make it easier for yourself or on yourself. But at large, there's always this sort of grain of resistance or opposition or criticism, and I would rather it be on me than on my son 20 years down the road.
This is the time to have that conversation, not kick it down the road for our kids and grandkids' generations to try to sort this out. Well, everybody's talking and everybody's being honest, and sometimes brutally and painfully honest. At least we can talk about it, and it's not just in the background and hidden, and no one is allowed to discuss it from any angle. That doesn't help us either.
And I think it goes back to what we're talking about in terms of how do you build a child? How do you build a human being? How do you build that individual? And so if you can break that sort of shackle of rigid identity, you are a Muslim, and I hear it, you can't attack the Muslims. I mean, there is no the Muslims. There are human beings who embrace a faith or embrace another faith. But if we can break that identity, that shackle of identity, you're able to have a much more fluid conversation without just taking it so personally and being so victimized or vulnerable when you enter that sort of space of exchange with somebody else.
How as Americans can we improve that relationship with Muslims and decrease the stereotypes? I know it's been all about education, but is that what you would keep saying? Is that we just need to educate ourselves?
No. Well, I mean, there is education, of course, that's constant. And so even how we educate people has to be more relatable, more entertaining. And I think Jason does a great example, great demonstration of that in his lectures. And this podcast is another one. And what I've learned in myself is no one cares about academic writing. No one cares about lectures. People want to be able to be entertained. They want personal narratives, but in a more realistic sense of the day-to-day, these are about human connections. And so the most time-honored tradition of breaking bread, I think, is really important. There's, a couple of initiatives that do that. Hello Neighbor, I think, based in Philadelphia, does that with refugees. They pair up refugee families across the spectrum with American families, which is the model that helped my family and myself acclimate and assimilate and acculturate in Germany. That model works. Airbnb and a few other initiatives host just, having a meal together. When it's really hard to hate someone when you've gotten to know them, more so when you've begun to understand them. And so when you can take that experience of getting to know another person, before their ideology, before their label or identity, just really getting to know that person intimately, that really changes the game. And so that means moving things outside of online spaces and into real spaces, so that the way that you would talk, even my critics, for example, the way that we would talk to each other in person is so much different than the way that we would engage each other online. And so, bringing it into real spaces is really important. There's a veteran from the Ahmadiyya community by the name of Mansoor Shams. He has a program that he launched, I think it was called 2929, where he took 29 Muslim veterans and placed them into American families, and vice versa, I believe. And so they were there for 29 days. And so it was just that experience of being in someone's home, getting to know someone intimately. Those real-time experiences are critical. And always be listening. It's just not that you're sort of caught in this knee-jerk debate of online, dialogue, which is it's really not possible. It's, are you listening? Are you having a conversation and really listening to the person? And so that changes things. Now, whether it's done through film, through conversation, in person, through literature, it's what causes an experience in someone's mind. And when you take what you knew and you take what you've learned, you observe how you got from here to there and how that change worked itself into your own life. Because having that conversation or understanding what does it mean to be Muslim American, or what does it even mean for a Muslim to understand the frustrations that an American person is dealing with. It's the shoe goes on the other foot as well. What does it mean that someone in Idaho who's never met a Muslim, who has some sort of fear-based reaction, like what is their thought process like? What are they genuinely feeling, and what part of that is authentic? Being able to understand that, no matter what side of the fence you're on, involves understanding your own process of how you got to where you are, where you were, what in your mind changed. And so that psychological breaking down of the fence is really, really important, because it's not just, do I understand that person better, but do I understand myself in the process?
Those are perfect. I'm going to roll some of those up in my class this fall. I'll be talking about some of that. And we mentioned on this podcast a couple episodes ago that food is a weapon of peace. And I think you hit it a couple times there. I mean, that is, you can't hate somebody that's just cooked you a great meal and you're sitting down getting to know them. If you know nothing about them, it's just going to be a good time. I love watching shows where people go on a tourism and travel show and they just eat all these amazing foods and they meet people and the conversation is always nice. You can't sit down and hate somebody you're eating with if that's how you get to know them. That's actually that's my icebreaker when I get a new class in session. I ask everybody, what is their last meal on earth? If you know you're going to die tomorrow, what are you going to eat tonight? And we all just talk about food. And all of a sudden, everybody knows everybody, and everybody's happy. And, oh, I love that too. And, oh, did you go to this restaurant? And boom, the whole class is gelled, and we go on into some pretty tough subjects. But that's one of those great equalizers is food. I think that's an awesome one. And
Do you know Steve Emerson? He's head of the Investigative Project, which is seen as this right-wing setup. And he's a really nice gentleman. I mean, I've met him a couple times. And so he's sort of, I'm going to use him as an example because there's a real story behind this, but also because he's sort of seen as, a neocon or anti-Islam, whatever. He's seen in that category. He was at a wedding that my mom was at as well. So they were at a wedding together, and I got to see this from the periphery, and I saw my mom, go up there. My mom is just, she loves cooking, and she's all about, socializing and whatnot. So this is a really great pairing. He's standing there, the 6-foot-something white guy with the white hair, and then there's my mom, 4-foot-nothing, with her exotic garb, and so they're just having a conversation. It's just the two of them with a buffet full of, Pakistani food, and he starts asking her a question like, "Oh, what is this?" And Jason, Holly, she just dives right in. She's just loving it, getting to tell him about all the different food and how it's made and what's in it. And she doesn't know who he is. She doesn't even care. And at that point, she's leading the dialogue when typically that dynamic between who has power between the two of them is very, very topsy-turvy.
Sure.
But in that exchange, that power dynamic is leveled, and she's able to guide him with zero interest in his politics. I think that is exactly what you're saying. You can have that conversation about food. It's a neutralizer.
That is an awesome.
That's a great story.
A great pairing. She is the master in this situation, and if they knew each other's politics, and ideologies, they might see it all different. But it takes it out. I loved your point too, and just empathy in both ways. I always say that I try to talk about tolerance, but tolerance in every direction. I don't just tell Americans, you've got to be more tolerant of Muslims just because. I say, well, in Muslims, you have to be more tolerant of Americans that aren't Muslim and don't understand, and they have questions, and it sounds rude, but they just don't know, and they may never meet a Muslim person again in their life. That's your one chance to, explain something in an empathetic way and say, oh my gosh, I never thought about it from your point of view. You went to take a taxi in Chicago, you had a service dog, and a Muslim taxi driver wouldn't let you in. Well, if that's your only interaction your entire life with a Muslim person, wow, what? It's my service animal. So
Exactly.
we need to have those dialogues, and everybody's got to be empathetic. Like, I just don't understand where you're coming from. Let's talk about this, or at least explain where you're coming from. I just don't get it.
Yeah, and people ask me like, "Oh, don't those really aggressive, hateful comments bother you?" And they truly don't. I don't care. I don't care if someone, who's from, wherever in the U.S. has never been a Muslim person and has no sort of coding in their language that would be seen as polite conversation or diplomatic dialogue. I don't care, because those are genuine points of not even points. Those are genuine people who they're just real people. I mean, they're not polished. They're not politicians or diplomats, and that's just their raw question.
They're being honest. How refreshing.
Exactly. I mean, what do I want them to be? A scholar? In the same sense, my own voice has changed over the last 15 years that I've been doing this. I don't talk about things in the same sort of language that I did even just 2 years ago. So what do I expect of someone who's going through their job, raising their children, and on the side, in the 2 minutes of spare time they have in their month, is asking a question? I mean, what do I honestly expect of that person? They're doing the best they can.
Right. And I think that, from my perspective, I started this with Jason because I am one of those people that don't know how to talk about it and don't have, the proper terms and language. And you say things so poetically that I'm like, I have faith that if I continue to have these conversations, I'll get better at it. I'll feel more confident. I'll, open my perspective, and hopefully other people will open their perspectives of me. And just being okay with the fear of maybe not knowing how or what to say, but saying it anyways, and hopefully having a conversation, and then ultimately learning and knowing what to say and educating one another.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're going to learn so much from you, because you're going to bring a new perspective into it. End of the day, I talk about these things, for example, in the very logistical way of, the work they do. I have the bias of being born in this, and living and breathing this, so that sometimes you become too rigid in how you speak, or you become too sort of, academic or boring or whatever. And so when someone comes along and says, I have, for example, my son's classmates, their moms, who you end up being friends with, they'll say, hey, I saw all the stuff you do on, I saw it on Facebook and this and that. I really don't understand any of it. Like, absolutely cluelessness. And I think that's beautiful, because that teaches me that I'm doing something wrong. And so when you come with a question, that's an opportunity for us, rather than being offended or rather than being irritated. As long as it's not done with malice or arrogance of, this sort of mindset of Islam needs to die and replaced with something else. I mean, when it comes, and I think that's why I have more respect and love for individuals who genuinely are just thinking, hey, I don't know, than people who are in powers of, or in positions of power, in positions of influence, in positions of politics, and they have this facade of interest, but they really aren't. It's just a toy for them. It's just a ploy to get what they want. And I think there's a big difference. I have much more respect and patience for average Joe and Jane, who just wants to have a question answered.
Right. And I like what you said about not being offended, seeing it as an opportunity. So instead of being offended, it's an opportunity to talk and have a conversation. And I think that's great. Well, and then Shireen, I know you wanted to bring up the campaign that you're doing to challenge hate.
One of the campaigns I've launched is a campaign against hate imams, and really more so it's about hate and alienation in theological places.
Can you just explain what an imam is in simple terms, and how they get chosen? Is it a prayer leader? Is it a scholar who's been trained at a school? Like, just those basics of what is an imam, because most people don't even know what that term literally means.
It's a great question, the question of what is an imam. And so we look at it as imams, as sort of priests, but they're really not. Religiously, an imam is nothing more than a prayer leader. So in a community that has a mosque, that imam, that person's role is just to lead the prayer, go home. That's it. Now what we've seen is that imams have become influencers. They've become community leaders. They're tasked with the impossible task of being, domestic violence counselors, social workers, psychologists. They're meant to be experts in Islam, which is really, really hard. So anyone that tells you they're an expert in Islam is probably lying to you. You have to be an expert in all the sciences, and most people are not an expert in every single Muslim science. It just doesn't happen that way. And so when we look at the imam and what they've become today, they've almost become the gatekeeper to religion. And so the way that Muslims look at and interact with imams, it's very much sort of this hierarchy, which is actually against the faith. We're not supposed to have these sort of hierarchy systems. And so rather than studying the Quran, studying the religion themselves, we rely on these imams who, they're not experts, they're just human beings, and their role is completely blown out of proportion. So now they've become sermon givers. They're chosen a lot of the times on the basis of just, what their resume is, or they're placed there. So a lot of the issues that we have with radical imams in the U.S. is because we look at who's importing them, who's supporting them. What's the background of the mosque board that's hiring them? Is there an agenda? There's no secret that a lot of these are Wahhabi agents. And so part of reform comes to really deconstructing who are these individuals and what is their role, what is their power in our lives, and they're not meant to have the kind of power that they've been given.
So you're really, that's quite a challenge, but you're basically taking on this idea. Look, imams have gotten all this power, and along with power usually comes some issues. So these imams that are not trained to do half the things they're doing have taken on this role and power in the community, and if they want to say hateful and violent things in the prayer service, and no one else in the mosque is really studying for themselves anymore because they just listen to this prayer leader, this imam, who may not be a religious scholar, or he may be. Yeah, that's a challenging thing to take on. If they've earned that power and that position in society, you're out there now trying to expose the ones that are taking advantage of it and victimizing their followers.
Yeah, and a couple of things on that. So first and foremost, I don't want it to be just me. This isn't a Shireen Qudosi movement. This has to be a collective effort. And at the end of the day, I'm fully aware that I'm female. I'm not an expert. I'm not a scholar. I'm not even remotely as religious as people expect anyone on the level of an imam to be. And so this can't just be about me. This is about individuals. Because at the end of the day, when we look at a room full of decision makers in the Muslim community, who are they going to believe more? And the fact is they're going to trust someone with a beard and a robe more than they will trust me. And so it has to be about more than just myself, because this needs to be a collective effort. And then when we take on the imam, the idea isn't, the hashtag that I use is hate imam just because that's a marketing ploy. It works. It's not being used, and you can have a hashtag that works as an umbrella for the entire campaign. But really it's about not the imam itself, because we don't want to demonize people. These are people who are probably victims in some sense or the other themselves. We want to really challenge the behavior rather than demonizing the individual, which is really important here, because if I demonize the imam themselves, I'm part of the problem, in the sense that when we look at Muhammad Ali's death, backtrack here a little, we look at Muhammad Ali's death around the same time as Florida Pulse shooter Omar Mateen shot up that Pulse nightclub. And we look at the community reception towards Muhammad Ali, and there's this fanfare and glorification. Meanwhile, people are saying that Omar Mateen wasn't a real Muslim, and they judged him for his behavior, meaning that because we're not approving of his behavior, which no one should approve of, we're going to sort of take away his Muslim card. That's a big problem, because the minute we judge people for their sort of pin their behavior on the individual, and we make it very convenient to just say, oh well, they're not Muslim, that makes it so much tougher to challenge the pattern of systemic sort of violence and abuse that we see going on under the umbrella of culture and through the name of religion. So it's really, really important that we do the same thing with imams, that we say, look, okay, yeah, there's a hashtag hate imam, so that we can sort of ride the social media wave, but really underneath it, we're looking at how does alienation and hate, surface in theological spaces. And
where did this guy learn to hate? He's not doing it on his own. He learned this somewhere. Who's teaching him to think that way and paying him to go speak that way?
Exactly. When we talk about reform, there's a big question of, okay, well, what is reform? Do you change the Quran? Do you change, do you challenge so-and-so? And it's really about the same example that we were talking about earlier when it comes to FGM and, real-time spaces and real-time solutions. And so when we look at the increase of hate rhetoric and apocalyptic, death of Jews, the sermons along those lines by a percentage of imams in the U.S. and in worldwide, when we look at that, those are opportunities where reform can take place. We had a situation in, on Temple Mount summer of last year, where there were, what were they called, metal detectors placed after a few incidences. And so that one small issue of having a metal detector placed ignited such a storm of controversy that led several U.S. imams to call for the apocalyptic death of Jews in their places of worship as a Friday sermon. And so one case was in Davis, California. Another case was in Riverside, and then we had about 5 or 6 more in the U.S. within a few months after that. And so when I look at that, and I look at the rhetoric, and and it's really, oh gosh, it's such dehumanizing rhetoric, Holly, because the scripture or the text. So this comes from a hadith. So a hadith is secondhand sayings of people who knew the prophet. So I can say, well, the milkman's son's daughter's cousin's teacher's nephew said this about Muhammad, or something like that. And even though there's a lot of work done to make sure all of those sources all along the way are reputable individuals who are trustworthy, these are still secondary sources. They're not primary texts like the Quran is. And so that there's a text in the Hadith that's used to sort of call for a hate and death against Jews, and so that's the text that keeps getting used. And when we hear hate rhetoric by imams in mosques, for me it's a great opportunity to ask a question: where is this coming from? How legitimate is it? And what can we do? And so while it's very, very, very difficult to get into the mosque, a lot of the times these imams are supported by the board. The board hires them, the board can fire them. And even that's a difficult thing, because there's a case in San Francisco where a fellow by the name of Suleiman Ghali opened a mosque for the first time, hired an imam, didn't know he was a hate imam. When he found out he was a hate imam, he fired him. Then that imam sued the mosque, and he won because it's San Francisco. And so now this mosque lost $400,000. And so it's not necessarily just, oh, well, the board is at fault. I mean, there's a lot of players involved, but the question is, why is this rhetoric happening? And so when we can't go through the traditional routes of, challenging the board or talking to the board, because we just don't get access, it's like the Kafkaesque sort of picture of a castle up on a hill, and you can't get through the gatekeepers. That's very much what it's like to work within a Muslim community on the ground level. So you go through another way. You use media, you use social media, you use conversations such as these to challenge the authenticity of the hadith. And so that's step number one. Where is this hadith coming from? Why is it a problem? How is it dehumanizing? For example, when the text says that even the rock and the tree will betray the Jew, that is it is just mind-numbingly jarring, because what you're essentially saying in this sort of ancient way of communicating psychological ideas to a population is you're essentially saying that even the natural order will revolt against the Jew. I mean, that is just horrible. I mean, it's absolutely horrible. And so those are the conversations that need to be had with whoever you can have a conversation with, so that we understand, what are you actually listening to and supporting, and where is this coming from? Because this is not the Quran. And so that's how reform works, essentially. In one very minute example, is you challenge the opportunity when it arises. And from there, you look at the larger issues. Okay, well, where are these imams coming from? In the case of Davis, is he a victim of the conveyor belt of thought and learning? how is the mosque being built? Who is it being funded by? Every single person who walks through those doors is a victim in some way. You can't blame the entire community. You have to look at where is the ideology coming from? It's not the Quran, it's a hadith, and that can be challenged, and it should be challenged. And secondly, how is it impacting the individuals, the Jews and the Muslims? Because every single person in that sermon room is also a victim, in my opinion. Yeah, and when we consider, a lot of Muslims are still largely, literally illiterate, having these conversations on that sort of higher level, end of the day, reform has to be about Muslims. And so if you can't speak in a way that is relatable to Muslims, so the second book I have in mind is very, very conversational and directed at something that even someone in the middle of nowhere, Afghanistan or Pakistan, can pick up and read and understand without needing to have an education. Or if they hear it, they'll understand it. That's really the goal, because most people don't have that background. They don't have time for it.
Thanks for listening today. We're just talking about it. We are trying to get through a hard conversation. It's not easy to talk about other people's religions, but you just made the first step. Please join us again on the next episode.
And if you guys have any questions, we'd love to hear them. You can email us at WJTANC. We're just talking about it, North Carolina. That's WJTANC@gmail.com. And you can subscribe, and please share with anybody that you think could benefit from these conversations, because we're just talking about it.
So thanks for listening. Go out there, keep talking, and be nice to each other.
Your host of the podcast, We're Just Talking About It, is Jason Chris Hauk. He's a retired U.S. Army Foreign Area Officer and has spent over 20 years studying Islam. He holds a master's degree in Middle East Studies from the Naval Postgraduate School, and he is a Malone Fellow in Arab and Islamic Studies.
Your producer and co-host for this podcast, We're Just Talking About It, is Holly Fleck. She has a bachelor's degree in broadcast journalism and spent 5 years in television news reporting. And she is genuinely interested in learning how to have a conversation about Islam as an American.